as less efficient than other vital organs. We will try as best as we can to maintain the desired level of concentration. Mr. Fuzile, we were at page 68 of your statement, and we had just finished your view of things when you were told that you're just a DG. I'd like now to talk about the next instruction that flows from Minister van Rooyen, which you deal with from paragraph 54. Are you able to canvass that part of the instruction? I think you use the verb demand. Can you just explain what he said to you, first of all?
Yes, thank you very much. At that point, Mr. van Rooyen, when we were still in his office, asked that I should work to ensure that by Monday, the 14th, I could furnish him with a handover report. And I go on to explain here that I think, in fact, that request was unreasonable. And I list the reasons that I can go through fairly quickly. One, because I've already touched on it, Mr. Chairman, at the beginning. I had received, for instance, my own handover report from my predecessor, Mr. Khanya, who was the DG. Yes. Mr. Nene, who was Mr. van Rooyen's predecessor, had received his handover report from Minister Gordon. So Minister van Rooyen had in fact refused earlier on, or in fact a day or so earlier, the opportunity to meet Mr. Nene, which would have allowed him to make arrangements either to start the process of handing over, as Mr. Maleka was leading me earlier on in that direction, correctly so. And of course, to the extent that time might have been a constraint, he would have had the opportunity to, the two of them would have had an opportunity to agree an appropriate time to do it. So for all of those reasons, and in fact, of course, the fact that it was middle of December, and I knew and then told him at that point, and later on, it became obvious, I suppose, even to him, when we met the executive, that most people who would assist a minister by sort of indicating or doing write-ups on the important projects in relation to their areas of work had already left for holidays. So then the timeline of requiring a report from me by Monday was actually very unreasonable.
Right.
I communicated.
Before you talk about the unreasonableness of the timeline, you reference an event in prospect at that point in time. In other words, an event which took place after the instruction by Minister van Rooyen to you on the 11th, but also to make the point that when both Minister Gordon and his deputy, Mr. Jonas, were removed, there was a moment when they did hand over the ministries, and they did so to their successors, who were both Minister Gigaba and Deputy Minister Buthelezi. You make that point in paragraph 54.2. Do you see that?
Yes, I do. I do. And really the point to emphasize, thank you, Mr. Malagato, for pointing me to that, is that even though, as the Commission knows now, Mr. Chairman, Minister Gordon and his deputy, Mr. Jonas, had been removed in the most unceremonious of manners, they still saw it fit to respect the practice normal practice, I might add, of making sure that they don't just walk away in disappointment, in anger, and not do what is proper, which is to hand over. Yet, Minister von Rooyen saw it fit not to agree to a similar process.
Yes. Chair, you will see that he makes that point on page 68 of Exhibit P at page 54.2 when he talks about that well-known event which the media describes it as the night of the long knives.
Okay, I'm sorry, Mr. Malaga. You'll have to repeat that. My mind was on something else. Will the legal team please make sure that in these bundles, such as this one, which has got Mr. Fuzile's statement,
Yes, Chair.
it's got other witnesses' statement, that there are markers or something that immediately tells me where to go if I look for a particular statement.
Yes, Chair.
So I've had to page through for some time trying to see where his statement was.
Yes.
So that would be very helpful.
Yes.
Yes.
Chair, I apologize. I see that your registrar has one immediately available for the present purposes. Can I ask that it be...
Well, it can be done later. For now, because I found it, that's fine. And maybe with other bundles as well.
Yes.
Okay, all right. Yes.
I really apologize, Chair.
Okay, thank you. There was something you were saying
Yes.
while my mind was on how to find this statement. You want to repeat that?
Page 68, Chair, paragraph 54.2.
Yes.
You would recall that Mr. Fuzile is now talking about the instruction that he must produce a handover report by Monday of the preceding Friday. So
Yes.
they're talking with Minister van Rooyen on Friday, and he's given...
That would be, was Friday the 11th?
Yes, Chair.
Yes, okay.
And the report must come on Monday the 14th.
Yeah.
And then he gives reasons
Yes.
why he can't do so.
Yes.
And one of the reasons he gives in 54.2 that he has already canvassed is that, but I had previously invited you, Minister van Rooyen, to meet with your predecessor, Minister Nene, who was available to meet you, to get a handover report from him because he is your colleague at an executive functionary level. And he was dealing with that fact by illustrating why that ought to have been the process, by referring to something that happened thereafter. And that was the dismissal of Minister Godan and Deputy Minister Jonas.
I heard everything that Mr. Fuzile said in regard to that evidence.
Yes.
It's just what you were saying, that last bit that I didn't hear.
Oh, no.
So I had all his evidence about the reasons why he thought that Minister van Rooyen's request was unreasonable.
Yes.
Actually, what I wanted to ask him, Mr. Fuzile, in regard to one of your reasons is whether when you had suggested to Mr. van Rooyen I don't know if it was on the 9th, but that he should come early. I think it must have been to come early on the 10th. Yes. Because you knew that Minister Nene either was going to be or was likely to be in the office so they could meet. When you made that suggestion, did you do anything more than simply say, well, it might be a good idea that you come in early and meet Mr. Nene before he leaves? Or did you specifically talk about handover?
I don't recall if I spoke about the handover, but I did speak about the opportunity for him to meet Mr. Nene and the opportunity for both of them together to address staff.
Yes,
yes. And in a way, I might have...
You may have had it in mind, but
for
you,
sure.
you might
No,
not
I
have
definitely
mentioned
had
it.
it in mind, but I mean, without appearing like I'm leading them
Yes.
and hand-holding
Yes.
them, but at least the opportunity to meet would have presented opportunity for a whole host of other things.
Yes, it's just that if you had mentioned specifically there might have been a certain angle in which I would have been interested in the fact that he was now asking you to give him a handover report. But effectively, you are saying that if he had taken up your suggestion, if he had accepted it, he would have had a chance to speak to Mr. Nene, and in all probability, their conversation might have included things like what are the most important issues that need attention.
No, it definitely would have, Mr. Chairman. I mean, one of the things, in fact, I had in mind was that I would sort of prepare Mr. Nene and say to him, look, one of the things you've got to talk to Mr. Van Rooyen about is the fact that we have a budget process that is running a month behind. Because normally we would get to November, the meeting that we went to, that December 9th, that is, used to be in November. But now it was maybe the second or third year in the running where it was migrating and going into December. And in fact, previously it would get into December and things would be concluded. But in that particular year, it got into December and things didn't get concluded because of the higher education problem that I referred to, which then was taking the budget process into the following year. And I mean, South Africans go on holiday or leave, most of them, between the 16th of December, roughly, mid-December, to the end of the first week of January. Usually people return on the second week. So, I wanted him to impress it upon him that there was some heavy lifting to be done even before we went home, so that we would give direction to the leadership of the department about the difficult task that remained, and even implore people to return a bit earlier than normal, given that there was still a lot to do. So I had in mind that stuff, that bit must be on the table, among other things.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then we can talk about the time frame relating to the demand for the handover. Minister Van Rooyen was quite clear that he wanted it by Monday.
Yes.
And you took a different view, as I understand your statement. You took the view that Monday was unreasonable.
Yes, I did.
Did you tell him that?
No, I did. I did. In fact, in a way, because I was realizing that we were headed for a difficult time, at my age, I realized that it's going to be very important that we understand the boundaries here, so that we can settle some of those problems, and then I decide if I leave. But what I wasn't going to accept or allow is that I get bullied around, less because I wanted to be a hero, but a lot because if that had started with me, and if it succeeded with me, then it would have meant that it's going to be a bit difficult for the people under me. And I'm not suggesting that I was stronger than them, but I was definitely their leader. Now, if I get humiliated and just get told, you can't have a weekend now, when a person has failed to do his part, notwithstanding what I consider to be reasonable advice, and then expect that you pass that problem to me, I thought, no. We should define a way of working that is professional, that demonstrates respect for one another, which is why then I still said to him, I will make an effort to make sure that you have got something, but at a reasonable time.
Then, what was your response? Because it seems to me that there is not a common understanding as between you and him. You insist reasonableness, he insists Monday. What was the ultimate conclusion of that, shall I say, a difference of view? How was that issue settled?
No, we had to settle for my time, bearing in mind that it was not even my duty. You know, in essence, strictly speaking, he was asking me to do him a favor. Now, you don't say, do me a favor on my terms.
All right, but ultimately, did you get around to giving him a handover report?
We didn't have time to get to that because the weekend's events happened.
So what began as an instruction ended up being a damp squib.
I wouldn't disagree with what you're saying.
Well, we're still there on the discussion between you and Minister van Rooyen about the demand for a handover report. And then you deal with a further interaction that took place about accommodation for him. And you do so at paragraph 55. Can I ask you to deal with that interaction in your own words?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. At 55, I make the point that Mr. Bobat did ask that we should accelerate the process of finding accommodation for Mr. van Rooyen, suitable accommodation, which, as I add towards the end of that sentence, the quotation, in quotation marks, so that he would not be accessible to people.
Why not?
A charitable interpretation of this would be that if a person, let me not use myself, if a person returns to, let's say, a neighborhood where people know him, and they know that he has been appointed or he has won a lot, everyone would want to befriend the person. I mean, there's a kind of a charitable interpretation that is that. But there could be another one here in this context, which is that they must have access to him. And by they, I mean him, Mr. Bobat, and that lot of people, without the people where he used to live having evidence of who comes in and who goes. Because where he is in a place where he is not known, that's easy to do relative to where he is known. I mean, my neighbors would know if the pattern around my house is changing from what it normally is. Whereas strangers don't know if I've got a particular pattern. They don't know who my friends are, and they may not even care to know who I am until, of course, they have got reason to.
Did you ask?
Sorry, Mr. Mulego. This is quite an unusual kind of statement, so that he would not be easily accessible to people. You are quite clear in your mind that that was said.
This is what was said.
Yes.
But I do want to, because one doesn't want to create stories out of nothing. Ministers are entitled to accommodation, temporary or transitory accommodation from the time of appointment, because usually the predecessor is allowed a certain amount of time to vacate the official residence. So in that time, temporary accommodation is not a problem. So there is nothing to write home about. Of course, it is an aspect that has embarrassed many ministers. I mean, it's common cause.
Well, what I was more interested, what I was focusing on was
the access. Yes,
Yeah,
yes, I know. I
was the part,
understand.
yeah.
I understand, Mr. But I thought, let me just get this out so that people don't say, there he goes. He ought to know that people are allowed accommodation. Let's just put that one aside. I didn't emphasize it here, but this bit is strange, and this is why one put it here. And I've put my own interpretation to it, and I guess the Commission can put its own interpretation to it.
Yes, but for as long as you're the chairperson would ask of you two things. One is, did you ask Mr. Bobert, as he's speaking for the minister, why does he want the minister not to be accessible to people?
No, I didn't. I didn't. I didn't. And I mean, I can't make excuses for it. But I was actually tired of the situation we were having unfolding.
Yes.
Because I don't put it here, but he had talked about a car. Of course, ministers have got to have cars, but it was as though he expected that there would have been a car ready at the swearing in, kind of a thing. I mean,
Yes.
you know, when it's just hours after the thing had happened. Of course, we had started the process, but we didn't have the car. So there's also a sense in which he didn't know a lot of what he was talking about, but which is why I was talking about his lack of ability to restrain himself and observe protocol, and just sometimes ask, you know, what is normally done in these circumstances. You know, he comes high-handedly knowing and making this demand. Some of them, in fact, all of them were inappropriate coming from him.
Chair, it seems to me that it's an issue or a topic that must, in fairness, be dealt with through Mr. Bobert's evidence when he testifies, because I don't think that Mr. Fuzile would help us any further on that issue. Strange as this request might have been.
No, he won't help us further, but I think he has been helpful enough to remember that this was a condition,
Yes.
that where accommodation was to be found for Mr. Van Rooyen, it should be a place where he would not be easily accessible to people.
Yes.
I think it's important that he has told us that,
Yes.
then the rest we
Yes.
can.
And when he comes, Mr. Bobert will ask him, because he is a public representative. On the contrary, he must be accessible to people. And that's what we do, and we will do it. And all of them will be accessible to the people, beginning with the electoral campaign beginning early next year, if it has not begun already.
And of course, there's a contradiction here, if I may. The statement says you want to take the treasury to rural people, make it accessible. And then you are drifting to a place where you wouldn't be accessible.
Yeah.
But that was the situation.
And I mean, something comes to mind, in fact, as we locate accessibility of treasury to people. My recollection is that you as treasurer also had that interesting but important public relations campaign on the budget, on the road shows. I'm not too sure if that still is happening, where you go about and engage the public on a widespread basis about the budget.
It is still done, Mr. Chairman. In fact, a variation of it that came towards the tail end of my tenure was to even include institutions of higher learning. Would go to almost all the universities, in fact, to most universities, let me say, to just interact with students and academics on the budget. Yes, you are correct, Mr. Chairman.
And many others, ministers that I do recall, they also invite the public to explain or send a wish list about what the budget should deal with and so on.
Yes, it started under the Tips for Trevor, I don't know whether to call it hashtag.
Yeah. And Chair, those campaigns are so widespread in terms of public engagement that the ceremony that might well come close to it, as far as one could recall, may well be equal or equivalent to the real carnival, but with less frills than the carnival of that sort. Anyway, but the point is that all of those things engage the public, and a minister who's the head of Treasury is accessible to the public and cannot be less accessible to the public.
No, that is, I would agree with that.
And then you indicate in paragraph 56 how you ultimately delegated the functions of onboarding Minister Van Rooyen to one of your staff members. I think you call him Mr. Study Mgomezulu, correct?
That's correct.
Yes. I have nothing further to deal with you on that issue, unless you have further things to raise.
The only thing I would say in passing, Chair, and perhaps on a lighter note, if it's allowed here, the actions of Mr. Bobat, by the way, were those of a chief of staff. The roles that he was performing here are what you would expect a chief of staff to do, which is to look after the well-being of the minister. Does he have so it's quite an interesting thing, which I thought I should just drop with the commission. So he was not quite too far off where he was introduced. Forgive me.
So you think that in terms of the actual work that he seemed to like doing, that was closer to chief of staff than, but he didn't want the title.
It looks like.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Then the next chapter you deal with is the real business of Minister Van Rooyen's visit to Treasury on that day, and that is to meet and greet the leadership of Treasury. You talk about that issue from paragraph 59, and I'd like you to be fairly quick and brief if you can. There are some highlights of that greet and meet session that I'd like to raise with you, but in your own words, can you sum up what happened when you went to, is it the DG's boardroom to meet the leadership of Treasury?
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, the first thing perhaps that's maybe material of interest to the Commission, Mr. Van Rooyen didn't bring Mr. Mabaso to that meeting. We can read what we make of that, but he didn't bring him. And Mr. Jonas also didn't attend that meeting, which was not the normal case. I mean, most instances people would attend. And of the people who attended, when you get to 61, I list some of them.
Yes. Roughly
now I've been talking to my colleagues to try and recollect. We can give the names to the Commission, the complete list. But many people were in acting capacities because the persons who were heads of those divisions were on leave, some of them. The one person that's worth mentioning perhaps in passing here is Mr. Momoniat. You might remember that he was one of the 4 people who had to be removed. In his case, because although he was on leave, he was still in Gauteng. He took the trouble to come to the meeting and arrived a little late, but just as the meeting started. And Mr. Van Rooyen, we sat in the room and said it was going to be a very short meeting because he thinks that everyone knew everyone. So it's just going to be a meet and greet. And of course, and he said hello or something along those lines. And then I said to him, no, I think, Minister, we should just do kind of a proper introduction, because I think that the people you have brought, which is Mr. Bobat and Mr. Whitley, don't know the people, and equally the people don't know them. Of course, it helped that one of the guys at the Treasury, Mr. Munale Ratsuma, I mentioned this, I think, in paragraph 62.
61, I think.
61, yes, 61 or 62, somewhere there, but I mentioned it that he very helpfully actually said, Minister, I think you don't know me, and I don't know you. And the minister had a difficulty at that point because, true and true, he didn't know him. So, because if he said he knew him, he would have said, okay, tell me who I am. So I didn't insist. I said, look, Minister, I think we should have a proper introduction. I was a bit, I didn't like what was happening actually, because if you just think about it, just take the case of Mr. Momoniat. He's a senior official. He takes the trouble to come, and you say, I just want to say hello to you. Go back home and continue with your holiday. And of course, it is in the context that we have discussed this morning and yesterday of what was happening in the economy. It is in the context where 2 days or so earlier, the budget process was clearly, as I indicated, running behind terms of schedule. So at least you needed a proper conversation. So I insisted on the introductions. And of course, at that time, something extraordinary happened, in my view, which is that he then tried, Mr. Van Rooyen, to introduce the two gentlemen. This didn't need to happen in his office. It occurs to me now, because he knew that we had met with Mr. Bobart. It was only Ian Whitley Mr. Ian Whitley that I hadn't met. If you remember, we had met with Mr. Bobart and Mr. Van Rooyen on Thursday. So the introduction in terms of names was not an issue. What was an issue was the introduction in terms of roles.
Wasn't Mr. Whitley also present at
no, he wasn't,
Union Buildings at this one?
No, he wasn't.
Oh.
To my recollection, he wasn't.
Yes.
But didn't you say, when I asked you whether, when Mr. Van Rooyen mixed up the titles, I asked you the question whether Mr. Whitley and Mr. Bobart were not in front of him, and you answered yes.
Yes, it was in his office, Mr. Chairman. Let's just separate the days quickly. There is Thursday, the swearing in. Only two people are there.
The 10th was a Thursday.
The 10th was a Thursday.
Okay. Yeah.
It's Mr. Bobart and Mr. Van Rooyen.
Yes.
And myself. It is now Friday. On Friday, I walk into Mr. Van Rooyen's office. I find him with three gentlemen.
Yeah.
The one I had met the day before,
yeah.
Mr. Bobart. Now he is with two other gentlemen, Mr. Mabaso and Mr. Ian Whitley. Of course, naturally, when I walk in, they stand and we greet and we say each other's names.
Yes.
We sit. So there is no formal names again. We talk about the appointment and so on. Now move to Friday. Sorry, not to Friday. It's still Friday. We walk out of the office to the meeting now.
The mix-up with the positions, on which day does it happen?
On Friday, the 11th.
At his office?
First at his office.
Oh, it happened more than once?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Okay, now I understand.
Yes.
So then this is the second encounter for me with them. The first with the rest of the executive. We're together now. So at that point then, he then says, okay, let's do the introduction. And he points at Mr. Bobart. And you can see there's a bit of an awkward moment because the name doesn't come out. And the guy helps him and he says, Muhammad Bebot. And he says, I call him Mo. So afterwards, he then says, yeah, Mo, the chief of staff says, no, advisor. So he continues then, it's easy then with the Ian Whitley because now it's only the chief of staff.
Yes.
So you mean he makes this, shall we call it a mistake for the second time?
Yes.
Now in terms of Mr. Bobart.
Yes, and just to be clear, Mr. Chairman, the mistake of names didn't occur in his office because the names were not said. The mistake in the office was the titles.
Yes,
or
okay.
positions.
Oh, okay, yes.
Now here, he starts with the name. He says, and then the person says, Mohammed Bobart. And he says, yeah, I just call him Mo. And then he continues to repeat the mistake he had made about title one more time. And the guy corrects him. And of course, it was quite tense, so I decided to really make the point to show that I knew the people I was with. And I took my time to introduce everyone, myself, and to say, look, this is person A, surname B, not the person who normally occupies the role, acting this one. The person who normally occupies the role you might know or not know. It's so-and-so, he's on leave, and this one, and this one, and I went around.
And it was many people on your part that you had to
It was
introduce.
many people. I could say, as I say, we were about 13, 14, all of us, including myself, excluding the new people. So then...
Before you go further, I understand the hilarity of that confusion as it is entertaining, but the consequences of it are far-reaching. And I would like you to deal with those consequences as you canvass them in paragraph 65. And perhaps a good starting point for it, in order to illustrate those consequences of the second mistake, is to read for us paragraph 65 in its entirety.
Okay. During the introductions, it became apparent that Mr. Van Rooyen was not fully familiar with neither of the two gentlemen, nor the specific roles he wanted them to play, as they had to correct him on their names and new positions. I recall that he said Mr. Bobert was going to be chief of staff, and Mr. Bobert had to correct him that he was going to be the advisor. At that point, I again remembered the telephone conversation with Mr. Gordon. Several of my colleagues who were in the room during the meeting had observed the same thing. And I know this because we talked about it a lot from that point onwards.
Yes. I mean, at that point in time, the mental process that had engaged with you, or you had been engaged with, was a repetition of a confusion on the part of Minister Van Rooyen, but at the same time, replaying in your mindset what Mr. Gondongwana had been telling you on the 9th, and taking the two together, there is some reinforced conclusion you must have come to about the far-reaching implication of the act of capturing treasury as it was unfolding right in front of your eyes, in your presence and the presence of your direct reportees.
That is correct. I mean, I at that point, it had become very clear to me that a lot of what Mr. Kodongwana had said had been confirmed, actually. It's not like I was making inferences. He said he would come with advisors given to him. There were points, as I have illustrated, the evidence that I've led, where it was confirmed that he didn't know the people. So it stands to reason that they were given to him. And it was clear also that certainly in relation to Mr. Bobert, and I want to make this quite clear, he was asserting this kind of authority of almost like he is actually the guy in charge. And you can see, I mean, the instructions he was giving, everything he was, or many things he was saying. And of course, by his own actions, Mr. Van Rooyen had shown unwittingly, inadvertently, that he was not sufficiently familiar with them. So, and the fact that he was making the mistakes about the roles would just seem to suggest that it's not like his own idea, as the chairman was indicating earlier on. If I have decided that I'm going to put person A, and I've determined that I need person A for this role, person A does not have to keep reminding me that, no, you said I'm going to be this kind of thing. reminding me both about his name or her name and also the role. So I'm saying in that context, there was no doubt that a lot of what he had said was correct. The one bit that I still, it was there, but it was to be confirmed as it became later on clear, was this connection to the Guptas.
Yes. Yes. Chair, Mr. Mokoena asked me to say to you that Mr. Mahajani will take this topic further when he testifies. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Because he is able to give even more detail than Mr. Fuzile is able to.
In relation to whether Mr. Van Rooyen knew his advisors or not?
Yes.
Oh,
and Chair, I mean, of course, he will come and tell you what he observed. But at page 48 of the bundle, paragraph 10, you will see what Mr. Mahajani say on his recollection and reference to what took place at that meeting. And whilst Mr. Mokoena is desirous that I should deal with it now, I would leave it for Mr. Mahajani to deal with it when he comes in. I don't think that it will help you for Mr. Fuzile to reference other witnesses' recollection of the issue. Then you go on and introduce your team members, and you say that at some point you reflect upon the Gupta leaks insofar as they refer to Mr. Mabaso and his involvement at the Department of Minerals and Resources. Again, that's a mental process that you are engaged with in the light of the events that are unfolding at that meeting or shortly thereafter. And it's that process of trying to connect the dots, as you say. And I'd like you to deal with how you now get lifted over mentally to what the Gupta leaks are saying about Mr. Mabaso.
If you don't mind, Mr. Malaka, through you, Mr. Chairman, I think paragraph 66 contains something very, very fundamental. I just want to make a point and then we cruise. Because in the meeting, if there was anything profound that was said, which I took away with a lot of discomfort, was the point that Mr. Van Rooyen made, that these are the guys that we would be working through. In other words, staff that goes to him would go through these guys. Now, I had no problem with the chief of staff, by the way, because that's the role that is a sort of a connection between the department and the minister in terms of just even instructions and all that kind of stuff. As I was saying, which is the job that Mr. Bobert seemed to like but didn't like the title. But that was something quite profound, to say that we would work through an advisor, Mr. Bobert. Because if you think about the sections that Mr. Maleka was leading us through of the law and the reference to the fact that the job of the Director General and that of a special advisor are totally separate.
Yes.
So he was making an egregious mistake by making that reference. I thought I should just make that point.
It's important because if I sought to suggest that I was skimming over it, that's the wrong impression.
He didn't imply, did he, that his advisors would also be between you and him. In other words, that you two had to reach him through the advisors. He was talking about other members of staff. Or you are not sure?
I am very sure.
Oh.
There is no reason why there should be another person between the minister and my report. Unless the minister has come to the conclusion that I can't do my job, in which case he or she, it was he in this case, would have to find another director general. What he cannot do is to do something that either borders on the illegal or that is decidedly illegal, as that section that Mr. Maleka had led us through says. So he was essentially saying, let me just put this very clearly, Mr. Chairman. Advisors don't have a business whatsoever issuing instructions to officials.
No, that I understand. You made clear. I'm more interested in whether when he said these are the people through which people had to work or we had to work, whether what your understanding was, whether he meant that you too would have to go through advisors to him. That's what I'm trying to understand.
Oh, okay.
So in terms of what was your own understanding of what he was saying, whether it included that he meant you too would have to go through advisors to reach him. Not that that is the role for special advisors. It is not, but I'm wondering whether that is what he meant, whether that's what you understood, or whether that's not what you understood, irrespective of what he meant.
What I understood was that he was saying all of us, me included, would work through those people, Mr. Bobert and Mr. Ian Whitley.
And this working through them, did it mean what I've just indicated my understanding is, namely, whatever work is to be done that would require him, people mustn't just go straight to him. They must go through the advisors, and the advisors might say yes, no, or whatever. Is that what he meant as far as you understood?
My interpretation was exactly like you put it, Mr. Chairman. In essence, they were going to be the filter through which what we propose, what we recommend goes through, which, by the way, is not even the role of a chief of staff. The role of the chief of staff is more administrative. Of course, you can have a different chief of staff who's been around the block, who might have the capacity to, in a collegial, polite way, say, maybe you didn't understand what the minister asked for. It is not what you are giving. But of course, in a DDG could conceivably say, let the minister tell me that, not you, if you understand what I'm saying. So I understood it in exactly the terms you are making, which is also that the instructions that come from the minister would go through them. And that's not a big problem in relation to the chief of staff, as long as it does not create a gulf between the minister and the officials. Because, as you know, if things go through people, then before you realize it, what gets to the minister is not what he wanted, then the chief of staff can say he or she didn't understand the instruction. So it is always advisable, it's not written in the rules, that the minister should get to have a working relationship with the officials, definitely the DG and the DDGs. It can even go lower than that, for that matter, as it happens at the Treasury, or used to happen. I think it still does. But what is not right is to plug between the administration and the minister, an advisor. because as we spoke about it this morning, the law is very clear on that.
Thank you.
And Chair, that it's a pattern that fits in. Within the theory, you heard of state capture. But where the law is quite clear, it requires a relationship of cooperation between specified public officials, in this case the DG, and his or her minister. You then get an intercession of a third party to break up that relationship and create a new link of reporting. And that is what Dr. Kaufman said to you before. We are now receiving live evidence to support that theory in the context of our model of state capture. Now, unless you have anything further to say about the profoundness of paragraph 66, I would quickly want you to deal with paragraph 67.
Thank you very much.
But
Then,
I'm sorry, I just want to make sure that I have a correct understanding of your attitude towards this suggestion or instruction or rule that the advisors would be the people through which the minister and everybody would work. Your initial statement to me when I put this to you to suggest that it seems it would be very strange if it included you. Your reaction seemed to suggest to me that you would really find this very unacceptable, because I think you said unless the minister doesn't want you, you don't expect that. That was my understanding of what you say. But you later on say, well, maybe it might not be a big issue as long as the interposition of those advisors between the minister and the rest of officials doesn't create, I don't know, I can't remember what word you used, but I think what you meant is doesn't create misunderstandings or walls that result in misunderstandings. So the second statement you made, this one, that it might not be a big problem as long as it doesn't create that, suggests to me that it might not be acceptable, but it might be tolerable, provided it didn't create misunderstandings. But your initial reaction seemed to suggest to me that you would have interpreted that kind of instruction or rule to say, this minister doesn't want to work with me as DG.
Okay, thanks, Chair. Let's come at it this way. We are talking about two roles. And maybe let me take one so that I'm clear. Take the role of advisor. It is even written in law. And there are things that the law prohibits insofar, in fact, says the advisor must do. And there are also things that the law says an advisor must do and cannot do. So there are do's and don'ts for the advisor written in law.
Not do, yeah.
And the law very wisely even uses a strong word, which is that the advisor should refrain.
You read it
and
earlier.
It goes on.
Yes.
So the law doesn't leave a discretion for me to like that. It just says it's not done. And I'm not in the habit, and the Treasury isn't, which is something I must come to just now because of something that happened on that day as well. I'm not in the habit of saying the law says this, but let's just have a deal that even if that deal is inconsistent with the law. So as far as the advisor is concerned, I'm saying I was affronted by the fact that the statement that Mr. Van Rooyen had made, in addition to the actions of the advisor already, seemed to be taking us on this course or path where, in fact, we were edging towards breaking the law. In fact, the law was broken on their side, but now here he was saying our arrangement here, if you use my interpretation, which you were articulating yourself, Mr. Chairman, he seemed to be saying that we should live outside of the framework of the law, insofar as the advisor is concerned. Then come to the Chief of Staff.
Before you go to the Chief of Staff, complete your attitude in relation to the advisor.
Yes.
Was your attitude, therefore, that insofar as Mr. Van Rooyen meant to interpose an advisor between himself and the staff, including yourself, are you saying that that was totally unacceptable to you and would not be tolerable? Or are you saying, well, he would be in breach of the law, but maybe I would have a way of how to deal. Leave it to him.
No. Let me say. I recall saying to him for the second time, in fact to them for the second time, that it looks like they are going to have to familiarize themselves with the law and with the ministerial handbook. And I said, because from Monday, I don't know if I said this as it's going to come out now, but the effect was, from Monday onwards, we must all know the rules and play by the rules. And I think I said something to the effect that, you know, as the Treasury, we pride ourselves for doing everything in terms of the law, and that's how we were socialized. And so I said, you know, we are not going to do anything that's illegal here. And I was not saying it because I was arrogant. I was just saying to him, there is the law, and it's meant for a purpose, so let's abide by it. And I'm clear then there is no room for any tolerance for
an advisor to be
there is no accommodation for illegality in the way in which we would work.
Okay.
It doesn't matter that Mr. Bobert was behaving in a manner that it was clear that he didn't deserve to be given a little bit of authority in a place as important as the Treasury.
And then the Chief of Staff.
Then the Chief of Staff, it is a matter of then interpretation. The Chief of Staff has got a valuable role to play in being the link between the department and the minister. But the Chief of Staff cannot be the substitute for a Director General and DDGs. Neither can he be or she be a substitute for the minister having a direct relationship with his DG and, and his DDGs. The minister must be able to talk to the people and get stuff firsthand. That is where then I was talking about. It is not inconceivable that a dynamic Chief of Staff can play a role far bigger than the narrow one of, I've put the file together, I've arranged that the minister must be there at the time you wish to see him. He can also make sure that, because he would sit in the meetings with the minister, he can interpret, he can translate what transpired and be able to marry these things usefully. Which is where then I was maybe muddling the thing when I was explaining it. He or she is not the mini minister, because once they do that, then they create this problem that you break the connection between the minister and the department because it's intermediated through this Chief of Staff.
So with regard to the Chief of Staff, your attitude may have been, let's see how it works out, or in terms of whether the Chief of Staff might be the one that you said could be quite, could play a bigger role than the smaller role, and you would handle it as you saw how it was evolving.
That's precisely the situation, Mr. Chairman. And I've got no reason in that short, very short period, dare I say, to say this which Mr. Ian Whitley said or did, I found offensive and to be outside of as far as I know.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Chair. Mr. Fuzile, even on a charitable interpretation of the law, the type of distinction you seek to draw between a chief of staff and an advisor is not tolerable under the law as we read it. But we'll debate it with others when the moment comes for that debate. Because paragraph 7 of the special dispensation we have talked about this morning at page 112, capital K, does not accommodate that type of distinction. We don't have to go there.
Okay.
You have expressed your views. Now we have dealt with that question of how the minister conceived should be the people that you must work through. I had invited you to tell us more about Mr. Mabaso in relation to the Gupta leaks. Is there anything that you wish to draw to our attention in that regard?
Yes, for sure, Mr. Chairman. I mean, in 67, I make the point that I learned later, and I don't know exactly when, but soon after I had seen Mr. Mabaso, as I said, I checked on the internet and any other source I could lay my hands on, that in fact he had been at the Department of Mineral Resources at that time, actually. What then that suggested to me was that, in fact, one of the reasons why Mr. Van Rooyen had emphasized that there was no need to capture his details on Persal, because Persal is one system for the rest of government. So if you type my ID number, you have got access rights and stuff like that, you would see who I am, where I am, and what role do I play, am I full-time, part-time, and so on and so forth. So in a way, I can say now, in fact, I figured this out then, that it wasn't possible that we could, as Treasury, also appoint him at Treasury when he was also at DMR. That's the first thing. The second point to make is that, in fact, it occurred to me now, when I connect the many things, that if you go back to the conversation with Mr. Kodongwana, who asked me to talk to Dr. Tibedi Ramuncha, who was the DG at DMR, that he was suggesting that maybe, not maybe, what was going to happen at Treasury, or was starting to happen at Treasury, had happened already at DMR. So Dr. Ramuncha was probably, in Enoch's view, going to share with me what transpires when a department is being captured. So I drew the conclusion that, in fact, Mr. Mabaso must have been there to handhold these other guys on how this thing is done, because it had been done at DMR with him as advisor there.
You know, what I find interesting...
DMR is, of course, Department of Mineral Resources.
Pardon me.
Why would Mr. Mabaso be at National Treasury, as far as you're concerned, on that day, when he had no role whatsoever to play in the meet and greet session that the minister identified as the first baseline of his business with the leadership of National Treasury? Why would he be there if he's got no role to play?
I think that he must have been there to, if you will, study the situation with them, for them, and two, to advise them on how it is done, but also clearly if he's connected to the Guptas, and in fact, given his connection to the Guptas, let me not say if, given his connection to the Guptas and given the logic that Mr. Godongwana was giving me, he had participated in the capturing of a department, probably had experience now in how it's done, and knew how quickly to do it. And you can imagine that a person who has been in a department knows how things happen in a department, as opposed to someone who comes cold from outside.
Yes. And in fairness to Mr. Mabaso, I mean, you did not have any direct evidence that he was assisting in the capturing of treasury at that point in time. These are the things that you tried to draw together from your subsequent study of his relationship with the Gupta family and also from reading the Gupta leaks.
Yes, that is correct.
But you did not have any direct evidence at that point in time?
Not of participating in capture, but as I say, I use the logic that there he was, coming from a department that, in the logic of what the conversation between Mr. Kodongan and I had suggested, was either captured or in the process of being captured itself. And there he was with a role that brought by the minister to play a role that the minister couldn't just easily to his DG say, I've got this guy, he's going to do ABC. So clearly, his role was not easily explainable, even from the minister, which then leads me to the conclusion, connecting everything, that it wasn't a role that the minister found it easy to explain. He never did, and of course, after the exchange that we had in his office, he didn't bring him to be seen by other officials in the department.
Yes. And Mr. Fuzile, I mean, don't misunderstand me as expressing a tacit criticism on you when I suggest that you did not have direct evidence that Mr. Mabaso was trying to help capture national treasury.
Okay.
Because it is quite clear that state capturers, like someone said, they're not like drum measurers who announce themselves when they arrive. Nothing is written on the forehead. You have to connect the dots, as you tried to do. Can I ask you now to deal with paragraph 69?
Should I proceed?
Yes.
Right away. Mr. Chairman, in paragraph 69, I then deal with the matter, some details in relation to Mr. Bobat, whom I learned later that was connected to either regiment or trillion or both at different points in time. And in fact, after he had been in the department, he got to the department that Friday. We were busy working on a presentation that we were preparing for a meeting of cabinet on the state of the economy and some of the actions that government was considering in order to spur growth. And we interacted a lot over the period from the meeting we had with the minister and the advisor and the chief of staff, and say Sunday sometime. And during those interactions, one of the things we were talking about was this presentation, because we were trying to help prepare Mr. Van Rooyen for the presentation, because now he was going to be the minister presenting the presentation. Of course, I learned that once the presentation was sent to Mr. Whitley, either by myself or Mr. Malone, who was the chief of staff of the former minister, then Mr. Bobat immediately forwarded that presentation to people connected to the businesses I've just mentioned, Mr. Eric Wood in particular. His name appeared on the people on the circulation list.
Yes. We'll get to how you established that Mr. Bobart had shared this information with third parties such as Mr. Wood. First thing first though, the chairperson may have gathered anecdotally and outside the evidence presented before him who Regiment and Trillion would be. But from your side, now that you have mentioned their names, can I ask you to tell us what at that point in time, and I'm talking about December 2015, what did you know about Regiment?
The company's name had been mentioned a few times in connection with irregularities that had happened at some of the state-owned companies.
Which
I recall Transnet for sure. I think later on some evidence came in relation to ESCOM as well.
And did you have that information in 2015 about allegations of irregularities involving Regiment?
I think I knew it in 2015.
What about Trillion? Trillion.
I mean, I know this is not necessarily the correct way to think about it. In law, companies are separate and stuff, but Trillion just splintered off Regiment. So you would notice that the personalities, they overlap in certain respects. In other words, the directors who ended up at Trillion came out of Regiment. So some of what Regiment did, they were somehow by association close or associated with it. And therefore, Trillion then got formed later on, and clearly with one of the key persons in it being, if I'm correct, Eric Wood, and he received this information, as I say, which is the matter of interest for me, from Mr. Bobart.
Yes. Chair, that's one of the reasons why we have placed before you Exhibit R. You recall it's that statement of the whistleblower together with fairly sizable annexures. And you will see that on
I'm trying to look for Exhibit R. Is it on this bundle or in a different bundle?
in a different bundle, Chair.
Oh, okay. Do I need to have a look at it?
No, Chair. I just
Okay.
wanted to note that Mr. Fuzile introduces the two names of Regiment, capital, and Trillion, whose full names and business activities are dealt with fully by the whistleblower in Exhibit R from page 2 onwards. And she gives you chapter and verse about who these entities are and the role Mr. Woods played in those entities. Now that we have identified what allegations were made about Trillion and Regiment at that time, and now that you have told the chairperson that you had prepared a submission for Minister van Rooyen, Mr. Bobart took it and shared it with third parties. We would get to the submission in due course. What I wish to establish from you now is what was the status of that submission as far as National Treasury and the Minister were concerned?
Like most of what we deal with in the department, the information contained in that document was about the strategic thinking, or at least shaping the strategic thinking of cabinet on how first to understand the sluggishness of the South African economy, the causes thereof, and also the thinking on what opportunities were there to exploit and how to exploit them to therefore spur growth, to accelerate the growth of the South African economy, and such similar things, and the preservation is attached here. But quite importantly, which is what I understand your question to be about, it was not meant for anyone other than people employed by the department who have the right level of clearance, and therefore it was never meant to be reproduced or sent outside. I'm not sure if I would be helping if I then just make reference to, for instance, the contract that advisors signed,
Yes.
which says something about information, if you think it.
I would want to get there just
Later.
later on.
Okay.
But if you feel so compelled and urged to deal with it, we can go there.
No.
No,
I'll take your guidance.
it's your evidence and you can present
No,
it.
I'll take your guidance to be honest with you.
Maybe we should go to that contract. It is Exhibit P, Chair, and it starts on 112 capital A. It is the very bundle that was before you, Chair. Is that one in front of you? 112 capital A.
Thank you.
But I know that Mr. Fuzile would like to refer to clause 15.
Exactly.
Which is on page 112, capital B.
Yes. No, thank you very much for all. Let's wait for it.
And you can deal with that clause in your own words about the nature of confidential information such as the one you are dealing with now. That is the presentation you prepared.
So in a way...
Let's take the chairperson along.
Yes, I've got it. You said
No, see, he
clause
said I
15.
should proceed.
Yes, on page 112B.
Yeah, I've got it.
He said I should proceed. So if you...
Can you read out that clause first?
Let's just read the clause. Yes. Thank you very much, Mr. Malaga. The clause reads, Mr. Chairman, the employer shall have copyright on all documents, programs, and reports compiled by the advisor, and the advisor may not reproduce or distribute them without the consent of the employer. So, in a way, just to start back, if you pause and think, Mr. Chairman, about the information that the Treasury handles, it is information that presents opportunities for business for people. If you can have it before everyone else, you are in pole position, if to use a phrase that is used in motor car racing. You have an advantage, albeit an unfair one, over competition. Similarly, some of that information, insofar as it relates to or has the potential to move the market one way or the other, in other words, cause share prices, the currency, to move one way or another. If you get access to the information early, you don't have to speculate now. The only thing you don't know is the exact magnitudes of the movements, but you know which directions things will move using past trends of how things would have evolved. So the point one is making here, if a person is in the Treasury and they have the proclivity to steal information, to distribute it to people other than the people who use it for purposes of giving advice and or doing the work of government, then you have a serious problem. You have a serious problem. So the point one wants to emphasize with this is that it was a very egregious problem that Mr. Bobert saw it fit to distribute the information. And part of the problem, whilst people might think that one is just being dogmatic by emphasizing the need for a contract, But when you have a person not having a contract, which they ought to have read, which tells them that these are the do's and don'ts, you run this kind of a risk. As some former colleagues would comment and say, look, this was like turning the treasure into a spaza shop. Now, I suspect that people who run spazas would find this offensive because they do keep records. So there's a sense in which this was a very, very serious problem. I'm sure
Yes.
words might not be communicating this properly, but I'm sure in the company of lawyers, you would understand it, Mr. Chairman.
It comes to mind that even you as the DG or any of your subordinates would not be entitled to distribute confidential information of this nature to anyone. And Chair, if I may illustrate that point by asking you to note that in Exhibit F1, you don't have to go there, I'll read it out for the record. It's Exhibit F1, which is the Williams bundle. There is a set of public service regulations which deals with code of conduct, which is applicable to employee of the state from page 111. And then the key part of that code of conduct from clause 13 provides for ethical conduct that the state officials must engage in. And at page 113, clause 13G says that state officials shall not use or disclose any official information for personal gain or the gain of others. So that's ethical yardstick that is reflected on clause 15 of the contract with special advisors also applies to officials of National Treasury. I draw your attention to that part of the Code of Conduct because the information which we now know was given to Mr. Bobert comes from officials of National Treasury. And they would have disclosed it as confidential information, not for gain by any third party. Now we can go to the information itself, and it begins as I have it from page 78.
Maybe before you go there, Mr. Maleka, just for the sake of completeness, Mr. Fuzile, in the case of Mr. Bobert, he probably still wasn't an employee of the department at the time that he distributed this information, isn't it? He was not yet an employee of the department. Or had you signed?
No, he didn't have a contract.
Yes. But if he had already signed, it would have been you from whom he would have needed permission, such as is contemplated in that clause of the contract that you referred us to, because it says without, I think it says without the permission of the employer.
Yes.
And not the permission of the minister that you would have needed.
It's a very interesting question. I suspect that if he asked for the permission of the minister would have been entitled to give it to him. The same if he asked it from me.
Well,
remember,
except
I signed that kind of a contract on behalf of government, stroke on behalf of the minister, to be fair.
Yes, but what would it not mean? Just go back here, cast your mind back to the contract that you referred us to. The representative of government, in terms of that contract, would have been the Director General. isn't it?
The contract says that.
Yeah, the contract says. So in terms of the contract, if it said he needed the permission of the employer, and in terms of the contract, you are the representative of the government, you might think different, but it just seems to me that probably he would have talked to you, although at a practical level, everything being equal in a normal environment, the minister would have known what he could say yes to and what maybe he might say, just talk to the DG about that or something. But I'm just thinking that in terms of the contract, I would have expected that technically you would be the person whom he would have needed to get permission from. You are not able to say whether that's your understanding or not.
I would say, Mr. Chairman, in the absence of my legal advisors,
yeah,
that would have been my interpretation.
Yes.
Because I have got documents that say that I represent government. Of course, if I had then time, I would have had access to the legal advisors at Treasury and say, is my interpretation correct that although I'm the signatory to the contract, I do so on behalf of government. And in this case, the representative of government in this institution is actually the minister.
Okay.
So if he asks, and I think that it's within the law, then I would do it. Except that in this case, the point is, I don't know if it's in law where you say it's moot, because I wouldn't have agreed. So it's academic, whether I was asked or not, because I wouldn't have agreed to this.
Yeah, but I'm just wondering whether the minister knew about that activity on the part of Mr. Bobert, and whether Mr. Bobert might say, no, I discussed with the minister, so I don't think I did anything unlawful.
Yes. Yes.
They would have, except that this one, I don't need a lawyer. I can tell you that there is no reason why even a minister, not even the president, I can say this, can take information, let's say for instance, or classified information and give it to people who don't have the appropriate clearance. It's as simple as that.
Now we know that the president can't do so because Section 96 of the Constitution prohibits him or her from doing so. Yes. And so is the case with the Executive Ethics Act Chair, which makes it quite clear without doubt that no member of the National Executive would be entitled to share confidential information with others for their gain or the gain of others. But here you are, Chair, you make the point which is quite important, because it reflects a possible tension, and I'm suggesting a possible tension by looking at what page 112A indicates.
Yes.
The preamble of it makes it quite clear that the employer in this case is National Treasury, representing government, and yet the secretary and the representative of National Treasury who signs the contract is the DG, without any express reference to the minister.
Yes.
So the key question you raise is that there is some level of tension, that it will be under this contract Mr. Fuzile who has to give permission for sharing of confidential information. Whilst he makes it quite clear to you that he himself was quite clear as the DG at the time, there is a systemic issue which we think ought to be explored, and if necessary, you should deal with the removal of that tension by way of recommendations on how contracts such as these should be formulated and reflected to remove some unavoidable consequence. Because you might have a minister who gives permission, and yet the DG who's supposed to sign it says, no, I'm not giving permission, and a tension arises.
Thank you.
I had invited you to look at the information which you say Mr. Bobert unlawfully shared with others, including Mr. Wood. And I had indicated to you that that information began with an email from page 78.
I am there, Mr.
Yes.
Chairman.
And Chair, people who know how emails work tell me that you have to read them from the bottom, working yourself upward. Because you'll see in the middle, it says the begin forwarding the message.
I'm sorry. I thought you were going back to the statement. Where are you?
I am,
On an,
yes, at the moment I'm at page 78, Chair. Page 78.
7-8.
Yes.
Okay. Yes, I'm there.
You will see that that is Annex LF2 to Mr. Fuzile's statement. And what has drawn me to page 78 is what he had already said to you on paragraph 69 of his statement. So in paragraph 69, he introduces this annexation.
Yes. Yeah.
And you recall, Chair, that in paragraph 69, he said the following, and I quote in the interest of time. I, Mr. Fuzile, also subsequently learned from former colleagues and media reports that Mr. Bobert was connected to Regiment Capital and Trillion, and that in the short period that Mr. Bobert was in the department, he shared some classified information, a presentation intended for cabinet, with people outside government, like Mr. Eric Wood. I can only infer that these are people who sought to profit personally from such information. A copy of the email attached as LF2. Of course, we do not know who else got the information once it had landed in Mr. Whitley and Mr. Bobert's hands. So that's how I get to page 78. And Chair, you'll see on page 78 that right from the top.
Well, you're getting to page 78 confuses me because the annexure, a copy of which is referred to in paragraph 69, is said to be marked LF2.
Yes.
But you are referring me to an annexure that is at page 78, top number on the page, and is marked AA107 and not LF2.
Yes. Again, there's another confusion because that AA107 on my documents is also marked as LF2.
Well, if you want to see for yourself, mine is not marked LF2.
Yes.
And the problem with that is that later on when somebody reads the transcript and wants to go and see the annexure, they'll get confused. The annexures that we all have should be marked exactly the same.
Chair, can I hand up a marker to your registrar and ask her to mark it LF2? So
Yeah.
that,
Yes.
and make sure that the most important person for the purposes of this conversation has the same document. Is page 78, annexure LF2.
I am on that page.
And how is your one marked? LF2 or AA107?
It is AA107. I have an advantage over you, Chairman, because in a way these are my documents, so I can swim backwards and forwards.
Okay.
Well, you see, if both of us have got AA107, it looks like it's Mr. Malega who is has LF2. Okay, all right.
Let me just dexterously hand 2 markers to you and mark LF2 using the black pen on the chairperson and LF2 using the blue pen on Mr. Fuzile's document. Please.
Registrar, Mr. Fuzile is no longer DG of Treasury, so you're not going to get a job at Treasury. You see, I see he starts with you.
At least you should take some consolation, Mr. Chairman, to the fact that she got torn as to where to start. But logically, I think she figured out that it's closer to me, and that it's better to start this way, in her defense.
Thank you, Registrar. I think we're now on the same page, Mr. Fuzile.
Yes, Mr. Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Look, just take us through the email. As I indicated to you, that someone told me that it is meaningful to read the emails by beginning from the messages, the addresses, and the timelines from the bottom, working yourself upwards. But you read it for us, you interpret it for us the way it is convenient to you.
Okay.
Well, I guess that whatever happens, to the extent that one page might have two or more emails, preferably the one that came first should be read first, and then the sequence then makes sense. To the extent that that might be the case, you know,
yes.
In case one is a reply, is a response to another.
Yes.
And you will see, to make the chairperson's point, that the timelines are identified on each of the sections of the email.
Yes.
The bottom one is the earlier of the top one, purely out of time sequencing only.
I would perhaps leave the very bottom, which is between Yolanda and I, because there is no contention there. The bottom of page 78 of Exhibit LF2, it's an email that I sent to Ian Whitley on the new email address that he had been assigned on Friday, and I'm copying on it Mr. Marlon Gesvent, who was the Chief of Staff of Minister Nene. And the idea really here is that he would have known, if Minister Van Rooyen at some point said he's okay with the presentation, Marlon would have known what to do with it, how to reproduce it, and to take care of all manner of things logistically to make sure that that presentation is available. The email, the essence of it just says to him, look, it's still early days, look at it, let the minister look at it, we can shape it as the minister wishes, but you know, it's time for him to help himself, familiarize himself with it. So Marlon Gesvent sends it to him. I suspect that what might have happened here is that the address, because it was new, I suspect this, I don't know for sure. Maybe it hadn't gone, because Marlon would have seen that Ian was copied, but Ian must have phoned Marlon to ask for it. But he then sends it to him. And of course, if you look above that, Ian sends it and he says, gents, finally, and you can see, although the perforation has taken his name out, but if the surname is there.
Yes.
So
then the person who sends
I'm sorry.
sorry.
Is that finally ...
Yes, gents, finally, yes, ...
Okay, well, you might not attach any you might not attach any meaning to the ... but I tend to think that it's got a meaning.
No, clearly it has got meaning. For me, it suggests that there had been communication which says something is coming, I'm going to get it, or others saying get it, because you can't say finally. If I send you something first time, I can't say finally. There must have been iterations or some interaction prior to that.
It's like at long last.
Exactly, Mr. Chairman.
Yes. But just in terms of the time frame before you proceed,
Yes.
you will see that it comes from Mr. Malon Gesvit, or Gesvind.
Yes, we understand. Yes.
On the 12th of December 2015 at about 4:38
Yes.
p.m.
Yes.
Right? And we know that the 12th of December was a Saturday, correct?
Yes.
And then he sends it to Mr. Whitley on that Gmail account.
Yes.
And he identifies the subject, which is the feedback from Minister Nkwinti meeting.
Yes.
And then he seemed to have sent it to Mr. Whitley at that time, 4:38.
Yes.
And then the next recipient of that email is Mr. Ian Whitley at the Gmail account on the same date.
Yes.
And he forwards it to a number of people at 5:36.
Yes.
Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
So more or less a period of an hour
Yeah.
elapses between the receipt by Mr. Malcolm and the sending to him. That's 5:36.
Yes.
And then he sends it under the same subject matter, the feedback from a meeting with Minister Nkwinti. And a number of people that he sends to include Mr. Mohammed Bobat at a Gmail account. Do you see that?
Yes.
It also includes Mr. Malcolm Mabaso
Yes.
at some account I can't identify. Are you able to identify that account?
I see it. This Malcolm at open something.
Open SBS.
Yes, they look like 8, some of them, but
Yes.
it's afternoon.
So, Mr. Bobat, if the email trail has anything to do with this, he would have received this forwarded presentation at 5:36
Yes.
from Mr. Whitley. Is that correct?
That is spot on, Mr. Malaga and Mr. Chairman.
And then, once he receives it on the same date, almost 3 minutes later, he forwards it to a number of people, and you can tell us who those individuals are.
Yes, the most obvious one to me is Mr. Eric Wood, and then there is another email that seems to be kind of fakeish because it's infoportal@zoho.com. I don't know if you will see the same thing, but you are correct. It's astounding that within just 3 minutes it had gone to those people.
Yes. And that would explain the chairperson's interest in the entry line in Mr. Whitley's email that gents, whoever they might be, finally, ...
Yes.
In other words, what we have been waiting for is
The
now
waiting
there.
is over.
Yes. Can I ask you to identify for us the key features of that presentation, which leads you to the conclusion that once you have it, when it was not designed or intended for your eyes and ears, you will gain an unfair advantage ahead of many?
Much later on, what you would see, if just take a page like page 95, it talks about initiatives to promote trade and growth. Immediately you see that, you would see that there is a bullet that talks to state-owned enterprises championing development and so on. And you just have to think about the connection with state capture and so on. But bearing in mind that this is not a kind of a budget thing, but as I was saying, it is a document that points in the direction of where government is going over the next while. You can continue then later on.
Can I ask you to, just on that page 95, deal with two, because one of them has become a subject matter of investigation by our investigators chairperson. And that is the third bullet point. If you could look at it and tell us what does it deal with.
Okay, I'm sorry. Where you have moved away from the presentation?
No, I'm at the presentation, page 95.
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you.
You found it?
Yes, yes.
So if you look at page 95, Mr. Chairman, as Mr. Maleka is sort of leading us there, you would see that the third bullet there signals the key role that a state-owned entity, for an example, like Transnet, will or is playing in the Maputo corridor. And you can see, I mean, in a way, towards the end, there is also reference to other initiatives that the state-owned enterprises in the period were either involved in or likely to be involved in the period ahead. Now, when you know this kind of information, later on when it becomes projects, and of course the mixture here of projects and just sort of directionally, this is where the focus should be. You can quite quickly, if you are an astute business person, position yourself, start an engagement with Transnet or any other entity that you think would have a role to play to shape things as projects, or as they become projects, be involved in executing them. You would have what we call in economics a first mover advantage, so to speak.
All right. I had invited you to just read for us the third bullet point on page 95, the second last bullet point.
Or the one that state-owned enterprises are championing African infrastructure development, such as Transnet Maputo Corridor JOC, launched in September 2014 to streamline cargo logistics between South Africa, Swaziland, and Maputo, as well as the ongoing development of prototype Trans-African locomotive suited for the conditions of Africa's railways.
Yes. And Chair, you'll hear something in due course about the connection of the rail line between Swaziland, well, between South Africa, Swaziland, and Maputo in due course.
Well, while you are looking at your next issue, excuse me, I would very much like us to finish with Mr. Fuzile's evidence today.
Yes.
I hope that Mr. Fuzile's position about working beyond 4 o'clock is the same as yesterday's position. Mr. Fuzile, if we have to go beyond 4 o'clock just to finish your evidence, I'm hoping we would finish within 30 minutes after 4, If we were to do that, would that be convenient to you?
I would certainly be willing to assist the Commission in that respect.
Okay, thank you.
Chair, I'm almost at the end.
Oh, okay, all right.
I will just...
I must say that your estimation yesterday was was horrible.
Chair,
You said we would finish easily within the time available.
Yes.
And even when I thought of us starting early this morning, you said, no, we'll be fine.
Chair.
Okay, Mr. Maleka, we all sometimes underestimate what needs to be done and the time. Thank you.
The importance of the issues, Chair, made me to pace myself like a tortoise. And I really apologize for that.
Okay, thank you.
But what I wanted to do, Mr. Fuzile, to illustrate the point that you made, is to go to the whistleblowers bundle, which is Exhibit R before you.
Okay, which bundle are we going into now?
R, Chair. R, yes.
Okay. And what page?
237.
Thank you. Did you say 2037?
237.
237,
Yes.
okay.
Are you there, Mr. Fuzile? Yes.
Yes, I am.
And this is a document introduced by the whistleblower in her statement. You don't have to go there, Chair, where she introduces it. She introduces it from page 14 and page 15 of her statement. But what the document reflects are several major government economic transactions. For instance, if you look at the first one, Mr. Fuzile, on page 237, it deals with the collateralization of municipal debt. And you'll see there it says, if you assist Tier 2 municipal entities to efficiently tap debt capital markets through facilitating collateralization of a debt with the financial assistance of DBSA and PSC, through the support of the mezzanine portion of this collateralized debt, this will assist in the infrastructure rollout required of a country and will, with national treasury oversight and assistance, begin to instill financial discipline currently lacking in Tier 2 municipalities, approximately 20 billion per annum, at 30 basis points. You see, anyone who has confidential information, knowing how you're going to create financial instruments around a debt of municipality, will have knowledge of how much you could achieve in terms of savings. And if you're a service provider to do that, you will certainly earn some handsome income by way of fees. And that's what this document tells us. Because if you go to number 5, you will see that again it's a collateralization of property owned by various state entities. And there, whoever does that job will earn a fee based on 25% development of the upside. And that's a huge amount. So what this document say, and hopefully whistleblower will come to tell us more about it, is that if you have this type of confidential information, which you talk about, you are able to enter as a service provider into government transaction space and begin to provide services for which you earn handsome fees. And that, after all, is what Trillion has been doing. That, after all, it is what Regiment Capital has been doing. And we know that that, after all, is what McKinsey has been doing.
I can confirm, Mr. Chairman, that the logic of what Mr. Malega is making makes perfect sense. As to the specific entities, of course they do feature here. I mean, their extent I've not investigated and studied, but as I say myself, the people were connected to them. There is no reason why anyone would want this kind of information that was shared here for fun. It is about placing you or an individual or his or her business in a position of advantage vis-a-vis competition, insofar as the opportunities to compete for business are concerned, assuming there will be competition, but it may even be about circumventing that competition. Needless to say, I mean, repeat the point, that the sharing of the information itself, even before you talk about the reasons for sharing it and the consequences of sharing it, was illegal.
Yes. Mr. Fuzile, we're now going to round up and conclude. I am now at page 72, and you have talked about that chapter of your statement when you canvassed the conversation you had with...
Sorry, Mr. Malega, are we going back to the panel that has his statement now?
Yes, that is Exhibit P, Chair.
Thank you.
You have talked about the conversation you had with Deputy Minister Jonas yesterday. I wonder whether you have more to say, or what you said yesterday was enough for the purposes of your evidence. You can go through it quietly. It begins at paragraph 71.
Yes. No, unless the chairman and you, Mr. Malega, feel that there is something to amplify. We have covered it quite extensively. Perhaps the point that it just cements.
Yeah, maybe you could just repeat the main features of that conversation.
No, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. In a way, what the conversation with Minister Jonas did for me, really, which is what I capture in those bullets, was to just now complete the picture. Insofar as, one, the role that perhaps I should use the singular here, a particular Gupta person played, where in the meeting with Mr. Jonas, he, in addition to offering him money...
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm going to...
Yes.
So it wasn't a meeting, it was a telephone conversation, or it was a
No,
meeting?
it was a meeting, Mr. Chairman,
Okay.
On 71,
Yes.
paragraph 71 of page 72.
Yes.
I start with this.
Yeah, just say how the meeting came about,
Yes,
and then,
yes.
yeah.
No, essentially, I had, one of us called, and I can't remember which one, but in the essence of it was, you know, it's what a day. And then the deputy minister said, I think that we should talk. And in fact...
This is now on the 11th of December.
This is on the 11th.
2015.
In the afternoon, around like 4 or 5-ish.
Yeah.
PM. So, and I went. I drove to where he was or he may have been heading to himself, but I found him there. And then he told me that around October, and this for me was the first time he had told me this, or I even heard about this. He had been...
I'm sorry, you say you had...
In October, it
Yeah.
was, for me, on that day, it was the first time in December
that you were hearing
that
about.
I was hearing about the approach that was made by a Gupta person
Oh,
to Mr.
okay.
Jonas.
Yeah.
And just to interrupt, you will see that there's a gap of a full 2 months between what
Yes.
the experience of Mr. Jonas has been
Yes.
and how he now begins to feel comfortable to disclose it to Mr. Fuzile. We know that he told you about who else he disclosed
Yeah.
that experience.
Yeah.
But
In
for
January,
now, we're dealing
disclosed
with...
to somebody else.
Yes.
So, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
So the stuff on paragraph 72 is what is known, I mean, how he ended up there. And of course, he said that he found this conversation quite disturbing that he had with the Gupta person, because he was insinuating that he had control over many things or everything that happened in government, almost suggesting that if he wants something and it requires the authority of the president, he can get it to happen. Signal to Mr. Jonas that he would like, in fact, Mr. Jonas did tell me that they claimed 2 other things, that they had information on him, in a way trying to blackmail him, but they didn't say what information. They knew who his friends were. All the stuff that has now been, he told me on that day. He said they claimed that many people worked for them, many people who are in government. Let me not use they, he. The Gupta person claimed that there were many people, important people in government, in key positions, and in SOCs for that matter, who were working for their interest. And they wanted him to take the job, and the president was happy, would be happy if he took the job. And in his case, he wanted that...
This is, of course, the job of Minister of Finance.
The job of Minister of Finance, thank you, to be precise. And he said, look, if he were to take the job, it would be good to help them to expand their business interests with government. And there were numbers mentioned. I think they said at the time it was 3 billion or 4 billion. They want to take it to 6 or 8, some number, big number, actually.
Actually, I was going to ask you the question whether, as far as you know, at Treasury, it might have been possible, or it would be possible to establish whether there was any connection between those figures that, according to Mr. Jonas, he was told about in terms of what they were making from government. I think they said 6 billion, yeah. And they wanted to increase it to 8 billion. Would it be easy for Treasury to check if anybody, how much any particular company may be making from all government departments and parastatals maybe, or not really?
I think I would take out easily, but it can be done, Mr. Chairman. And I say I'm taking easily out of it because, let me just say, it can be done. But it's an exercise that would entail that the Treasury would have to ask for the information. You can't just do it from a systems point of view.
Yes.
Treasury can go quite far to get that information from national government departments.
Yeah.
But the entities, because those departments are on the same system, IT system, so to speak, that's why it's possible to pull reports and correlate them relatively easily. But the entities are kind of independent states of sorts. But the Treasury has got the authority in law, which I think can be stretched to allow it to ask for that information. But I mean, my successor would be in a position to answer that question better than me. I don't want to set him up for...
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, no, but what you have said is helpful.
Yes. And Chair, I mean, we asked the investigators to get that sort of information from the auditors of Oak Bay and associated companies, which is the almost near full picture of the Gupta empire.
Okay.
And we know that the auditors have begun to disclose the financial information under a subpoena, of course.
Okay.
But if we could get information from Treasury along those lines, it will provide important corroborative evidence.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, thank you.
So we will take that issue with Mr. Mahajane.
Yes, please.
In
Yeah.
fact, that will be installment number 1 before he testifies.
Yes.
So, should I continue?
Yes.
So, quite critically, and this is, I think, why Mr. Maleka is also suggesting correctly that we could go through this fast. If you look at 75, then Mr. Kodongwana, sorry,
Mr. Jonas.
Mr. Jonas, thank you, dropped this bombshell. This is now the afternoon. I call it a bombshell where he said, they said one of the tasks he would have to perform when he first gets there would be to dismiss the 4 offers that I list there. And we ventilated the issue, Mr. Chairman, yesterday as to what...
well, you mentioned them yesterday, but we just...
It's Mr. Ishmael Momoniat, it's Mr. Kenneth Brown, it's Mr. Andrew Donaldson, and myself.
Yes.
I suspect that our experience just at the Treasury, the 4 of us, would add up to a number upwards of 8 years. Of course, they overlap those years.
Of course, Mr. Kenneth Brown was Chief Procurement Officer.
He was Chief Procurement Officer.
So he was one of those that they didn't want.
The role was
Mr.
putting
Jonas.
him sadly in the line of fire because he was writing rules for procurement, sort of amending them for us, for government, so to speak, with the view to making the process more transparent so that it would be less easy to manipulate procurement processes, or it would be easier to get caught when you have actually done so. For instance, the publications of who has won which tender and who are the directors and. But at the same time, there was a stepping up of enforcement. For instance, he initiated a process to review contracts beyond a certain threshold, just to see if there was malfeasance in those. And of course, there was suspicion of it, strong. And the reports on those, some of them are at the Treasury, and I would presume that some of them are still work underway. But just that kind of work had meant that he had become a problem by wanting to insist that there shouldn't be stealing, there shouldn't be manipulation of tender processes and stuff like that. I can't imagine any other reason why, because the role of that position was not broad. And I said, Mr. Momoniat was, he is, he does tech stuff. Sometimes people think that what SARS does administratively and in terms of enforcement is he has asked them to do, but he doesn't. I mean, but not in the sense of directing them necessarily. He is instrumental in terms of shaping tax legislation, including the administration of tax for that matter. But one of the important roles that he plays, and I said this yesterday, is in advising the minister and the DG on financial regulation, including tightening the laws on anti-money laundering, the issues of reporting on suspicious transactions. I mention this because there is enough evidence in the public domain that these kinds of legislation were resented. People didn't resent them simply because they were there, because they knew that they would make it harder to engage in those kinds of activities, which entail the ability to move and to enjoy proceeds of crime. So this kind of shocked me, but I quickly connected it to the fact that, and the fact that he was going to be given replacements for us, including advisors. So if you go back to the story of Wednesday night with Mr. Gordon, who said, you will get a Gupta minister, he will be given advisors. He might not even know them very well. They would be of Indian descent. So I said, oh, okay, so this stuff was planned as far back as October. I had no reason whatsoever to doubt Mr. Jonas's version of these events. So I then came to the conclusion, quite firmly, that the gentleman that Mr. Van Rooyen showed up with, whom he didn't seem to know well, must in fact have been given to him by the Gupta person or the Mr. Gupta that Mr. Jonas spoke to. Hence, he didn't know them all too well, including the roles that he was going to assign them. And indeed, if you just look, perhaps jumping now a bit, I hope I don't muddy the waters with it, it's clear that Mr. Bobat was, the way he was just approaching me, the way he was abrasive, impolite, throwing his weight around, had the hallmarks of making sure that right from the word go, it was untenable for me or unbearable for me to stay in the department and hopefully leave. I mean, I can say today it's known factually that he was wrong. I wasn't going to go anywhere. Certainly not pushed away by him. And of course, so I'm saying that it was then clear to me, because the Gupta person said it to Mr. Jonas. And Mr. Jonas said the president's son was there. That, in fact, there was a connection of most of what we were going through as an institution and as individuals to the person of the president, just given how this was unfolding. So I think that's enough to say. In fact, I just make this last line where which is partly the reason I at some point just felt I should actually leave the Treasury. Without saying much, I mean, it became obvious that there we were, we had had Minister Manuel. You could say he had been tired of the job, he had been there for too long, but he was replaced by a competent person in Mr. Pravin Gordhan, who after just one term was replaced by yet another competent person. You could say he was a committee member for years, deputy minister for many years, easy chemistry, knew the job in Mr. Nene. Now, you come from having a minister for 13 years without a change in a department. And all the benefits that went with that, actually. You have a minister for just one term. And then next time, just 18 months. I actually just thought, look, it is obvious to me, and this I can say, at least in my mind, without fear of contradiction, it can be denied by others. It was obvious to me that there was a mission to make sure that we end up ultimately with a minister who would be pliable, a minister who would be weak and therefore weaken the Treasury. And after having been in the department for the length of time that I was there for, I wasn't going to be there and be party to decimating an institution that I inherited, being very strong, being recognized worldwide for its strength. I used to even sometimes say it jokingly, Mr. Chairman, to people and say, let's say that people who talk this ill about Treasury, sometimes even in my presence, I would say, you know, let's say you think that people the world over are wrong in thinking that the Treasury does its job well. But it benefits South Africa and South Africans, because then it gets people to invest in government bonds, and therefore enables government to finance its pro-poor programs and whatever it does. So would it annoy you so much as a South African that you would want to tell the world that you are wrong in thinking that this treasury of ours is good? It is actually bad, it is weak. Of what good would it be? So anyway, I'm saying that it became clear from that conversation that I had with Mr. Jonas that what we were going through was actually very bad, was terrible. Yes. And it was orchestrated with the president sadly at the center of it.
And then you conclude that after that conversation with Deputy Minister Jonas, you were deeply disappointed and demoralized. And I can understand that you had taken so much in the 2 days, and you were thinking about your future. But as we have it, fate intervened, and you outlasted those who thought they will replace you. Can I ask you now to, just by way of concluding remarks, share with us the lessons that we can learn and around which we can make recommendations to the chairperson about how to even strengthen further national treasury if it is not strong or stronger already?
I would say, Mr. Chairman, what we went through around that time taught me several things. One of the things that placed us in good stead, that ensured that we were able to weather the storm, to withstand a lot of the negative stuff that was buffeting us from all sorts of angles, including from the highest office, was the fact that we were led, and when I say we were led, I would just first take the politicians or the political office bearers we had in Mr. Gordon and Mr. Jonas, by people who hold our constitution very dear and all the laws of the country. I said this several times in the department on the occasion that we would celebrate one or some other event and have the minister and the deputy minister around, that I was very proud to work with two people, with Mr. Gordon and Mr. Jonas. And of course, you can add Mr. Nene to that list. You can even add Mr. Manuel to that list, and Mr. Muleketi Jabo. We were led over this period of time by people who never sought to do anything themselves or ask us to do things that were aimed at helping them or people connected to them to gain, personally or for themselves. I used to say that not once have I had to face a dilemma where I'm faced with a minister or a deputy minister who's trying to do something that I feel uncomfortable with because it is incongruent or in contravention of the law. That was very powerful. And the lesson from that, if I were to be direct with what Mr. Maleka has asked me, is that anyone who happens to find themselves in a position, let's say of a director general, for that matter of a DDG in a department, or in a department, in a managerial position, if you know the rules, you know the law, it helps to make sure that first time when a person tries to ask you to do something that is illegal, to let them know. And let them know in no uncertain terms that you are not going to be party to doing a crime. There are many people, some of them now tell untruths. They say they liked me when I was in government because they say, we always knew where we stood with you. I don't like talking about myself in these terms, but In my case, it's either something it's legal, it's worth considering, it's either something is in the national interest and therefore we can debate it. Once it is illegal or it is not in the national interest, then it is off the table and you wouldn't live with any doubt. So it's important to be law-abiding. And the issue of playing by the rules is important because at every point, if you look at my interactions with Mr. Van Rooyen, Mr. Bobat, over that short period, I kept making reference to the rules. I was not making the rules for them. The rules had been made for all of us. All I was doing was to draw their attention to the rules. But I would say the bigger issue for me, which one has got to say carefully, just having heard the question that the chairman was putting to Mr. Cotton yesterday, is it just seems to me that even at points when there were signs that state capture was happening, corruption was happening, or whatever you choose to call it, there are many people who opted, I think, chose not to see it. I don't think that with all that we're watching playing itself in front of us, many of us as South Africans, especially those who happen to be close to things, like ourselves, can say that we were shocked by the very last events that came, let's say, for instance, from the Gupta leaks or whatever other event people remember as the big event that makes it very hard for them to deny that they see that state capture is happening or corruption is happening. What do I say by this? You ask me for lessons. When you see something, when it smells fishy, then it is fishy. You have got no excuse to say, I thought it was smelling good. I like the quote that Mr. Maleka started with, which was the one that Mr. Gordon concluded with. The reason these terrible things happened is because many good people kept quiet. I don't buy the excuse that is convenient that people make that they didn't notice. Of course, you may not notice from the first event, but the thing is that too many events were happening here. Too many events were happening here. And what is said about it is that you will meet people. We may still like it when people commend us and say we did well by stopping this or stopping that, or you know. But I take no comfort from that because it wasn't easy. I say this because there were moments when some of my direct reports would walk into my office, some of them on the verge of breaking down, and they would say to me, listen, this department is actually under attack. And I would sometimes myself play to the gallery, if I may call it that. I said, look, I don't think we're under attack, but there are just too many things happening. ABC, things are going to get better. But the reality is that bad stuff was happening. Bad stuff was happening. And I'm sure the picture, I hope, the picture I've painted here with this very short submission that has taken a little long to go through does help to fit a few pieces of this jigsaw puzzle, such that South Africans can form a picture of their own. I say to people, as I end, my reason for coming to help the Commission, now and in future if I do come, is less, and I say it's not...
I thought it was when, not if.
When?
Yes. I thought it was when.
Sorry. I'm saying my reason for coming here...
And you say, and in the future, if you come.
No.
But based on the fact that you clearly said there is a lot that you would like to share with the Commission.
Let me say, when I come back, the reason for doing what we do and taking whatever risk it would entail is less about being heroes, certainly not for me, and I suspect for all of us who came here. It is also less, certainly for me, about being vindicated or being vindictive insofar as those people who did things that are bad. When I say, for instance, if I use the example of my own submission, Mr. Bobat broke the law, it is not because I just hate the guy and I wish he would be jailed tomorrow. That would be fine too, because if he pays for his own sins, who else should pay for them? But the most important thing about it is the lesson for every South African. It is the lesson for every South African that it carries. That this is a country governed by a constitution and law. Your first point of reference ought to be that if you are coming into the civil service, in fact, every sphere of life. So one would hope that as we come here, present evidence, it helps South Africans form a picture of what happened. But not only that, it also then helps South Africans learn so that in future, if something similar starts to happen, it can be stopped much earlier than what this one has done. You only need to look at what, for instance, some of the state-owned companies, the state in which they are in, to see the egregiousness of what we went through. Thank you very much.
Are you done?
Chair, just for me to thank Mr. Fuzile, and through him to appeal to many others to heed the very important call of Professor Nimura, that we are here and we are at this stage of our nascent democracy, afflicted by these acts of state capture, simply because good men and women chose to keep quiet when there was a time and moment for them to speak. And through you, we would definitely keep on asking those questions. Why they remained quiet at that moment when they were supposed to speak? I mean, a searching part of the conversation you have heard from Mr. Fuzile's evidence is that there was a moment of quietude for 2 months in relation to crucial information which affected him in such a way that he was not only demoralized but thought of leaving Treasury. And so, as much as we may be thought to be nonsensically critical of the silence, we would appeal in advance and ask for your forbearance to keep on asking these questions from every other person who would come to appear before you and testify. Why was that moment of silence? And we will put those questions to anyone who would come to testify before you. Other than that, let me apologize for you for taking so long and making mistaken estimations of time.
No, thank you, Mr. Malega. Well, Mr. Fuzile, thank you very much for coming to give evidence. And my understanding is that, like Minister Gordon and Minister Nene and former Deputy Minister Jonas, you came voluntarily because you appreciated the need for you to come and assist the Commission. I have before specifically appealed to current Directors General of departments and former Directors General, quite apart from cabinet ministers past and present, to come forward and give the Commission information and evidence about what they knew. And I've said that when I make these appeals, it's not because we depend completely on people coming forward on their own to give us evidence. We have an investigation team, they are investigating. Some of the things we will find ourselves, but it would be very good if people who know information that's relevant came forward, because to the extent that at the end of this process I may find that there was state capture, the question will arise as to who had a duty to do what when they realized. And I've said that question will arise in regard to the governing party, to say, as the governing party that was given power over these years by the electorate, when did they realize that there was state capture, and what did they do about it? The same will arise with regard to the executive. When did different members of the executive realize what was happening, and what did they do about it? And to the extent that whether it's the governing party or it's members of the executive, to the extent that they may not have done what they ought to have done, is it because there was an environment or a framework that made it difficult for people to do what they were supposed to do? And if so, what is that environment? We must identify it so that the Commission can then address, deal with that environment in recommendations to say we should not have this kind of framework or this environment going forward, because this kind of environment, if it continues to exist, will facilitate another state capture in the future. We need to look at those, but we need people in the governing party, in the executive, in government, everywhere, and outside of that, people who can observe, who observed things, who participated in things, in activities, to say this environment provided fertile ground for state capture. It needs to be changed if we are serious about wanting to make sure that state capture doesn't happen again. But to be able to do that effectively and to get the truth and the real depth and extent of these things, we need people to be able to come forward and speak without fear of any physical harm to them, fear of being prejudiced in any other way or being marginalized. People must be allowed to say, I want to make a contribution in the rebuilding that needs to take place, to the extent that there may have been state capture, and the state capture may have involved a certain amount of destruction of our country. So people who take the trouble to come to the Commission and say, I want to make my own contribution, I want to say what I knew, what I saw, and help the Commission to help the country, they must be able to come forward and say so without fearing that they may be marginalized by whoever. So I hope that your coming here like that of Mr. Temba Masego right at the beginning of our proceedings, will encourage both current directors general and former directors general who knew things, who knew what happened, to come forward and say, I will not stand on the side. I will join those who are trying to rebuild, who are trying to help the Commission to make sure that the future of the country will be better than the times when there was state capture, if indeed in the end I find that there was state capture. But once again, thank you very much for coming forward, and I've no doubt that you will return. Thank you very much. You are excused.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Pretorius, I see you standing up. Is that for the condonation application?
Chair, it's simply to request you to direct whether you wish to hear it now or would prefer to hear it tomorrow. It won't take long, but perhaps you could give that some thought. Also to state that as a result of the length of time that Mr. Fuzile has taken, there has to be some amendment to the program. It was planned that, and I might say that Council's prediction of time is a feature common to all Council. It's not unique to Mr. Maleka. The plan was that tomorrow Mr. Manye would return to the witness box, but as you stated in chambers, it's preferable that the trio of Treasury witnesses complete their evidence on term of reference 1.8 before Mr. Manye comes. Arrangements have been initiated through the Commission Attorney to delay Mr. Manye's arrival until Monday, if that's appropriate.
Yeah, no, I think that Mr. Manye was going to give evidence after certain witnesses had given evidence before him. Those witnesses haven't, or some have, but there are still others that that were ahead of him in terms of the arrangement. I think we should hear those first, more so because what they'll be testifying about is linked to the evidence of Mr. Fuzile and Mr. Gordon. So what I don't know, as I understand, it's two witnesses. Is that right? Two.
Yes, Chair.
What I don't know is whether we would finish them within the 2 hours that we will have tomorrow afternoon. But if we don't finish, we should finish them first, even if on Monday, then Mr. Manye can come in.
Any answer that the three of us give is subject to the same questions that have already arisen into the length of Mr. Fuzile's evidence.
So that there is a reluctance to...
We can attempt to answer, but you take your chances.
Okay, no, what we'll do is one, tomorrow, let me just make it clear, we are only going to resume at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and so we won't be sitting in the morning. That is because in my other job I have to attend some other business at the Constitutional Court. So once I'm done there, I will come here. It's something important that will be happening for the first time in the country. So we'll resume at 2 o'clock tomorrow. So we will then hear one or both of the witnesses, depending on whether we finish the one who will start. And then once we have finished with the second one, whether it's tomorrow or it's on Monday, then Mr. Manyi can then come in. So I would leave it to the legal team to be in touch with him.
Thank you, Chair.
But I understand he has been informed already about tomorrow.
Yes, Chair.
Yes.
That leaves your direction about the condonation application.
Maybe I should deal with it now, then we know. I was told at some stage there was counsel who was ready, but if there are challenges, I can hear it tomorrow at 2. Okay, it looks like it's better tomorrow at 2.
Thank you, Chair.
Is it better at 2 o'clock tomorrow?
Yes, Chair.
Okay, that condonation application will be dealt with tomorrow at 2 o'clock. We therefore adjourn for the day, and once again we'll resume at 2 o'clock tomorrow.
Thank you.
We adjourn.